April 26, 1986. Reactor 4 at Chernobyl explodes, and within days, 350,000 people are gone. Scientists predicted a radioactive desert lasting centuries. No birds, no mammals, no recovery. Then on April 26, 1986, the most contaminated landscape in human history began its transformation into something nobody predicted. 40 years later, satellite images showed dense forest, wolf packs, and herds of wild horses where cities once stood. What happened inside the exclusion zone defies every model scientists had ever built. If you'd asked anyone in Kyiv about Chernobyl back in 1986, they would have told you the land was finished forever. They had no idea. The Chernobyl Exclusion Zone covers 2,600 square kilometers, roughly the size of Luxembourg, sealed off from the world and left completely abandoned. The city of Pripyat, home to 50,000 people, was emptied in just 36 hours. Residents were told to pack for 3 days. Most never came back. Apartments still hold family photographs on the walls. Classrooms still have books open on desks. An entire civilization frozen mid-sentence. Radiation doses near the reactor in those first days reached 16,000 times above safe human exposure limits. The surrounding pine forest absorbed so much ionizing radiation so rapidly that the needles turned a deep rust red and died within weeks. Scientists named it the Red Forest, 10 square kilometers of standing dead timber, saturated with cesium-137, strontium-90, and plutonium isotopes that would remain dangerous for generations. Early predictions were unambiguous. The soil was too contaminated to support complex ecosystems. Decomposers would fail. The food chain would collapse. Decades of biological silence were expected. A dead zone in the truest sense of the word. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. If you're wondering how that's even legal, so is everyone else, because what scientists began documenting just a few years later should not have been possible under any model they were working with. The land was supposed to stay dead. For a while, things actually seemed fine. Early surveys showed almost nothing moving through the zone. That didn't last. The Red Forest is still one of the most contaminated terrestrial sites on Earth. Decades after the explosion, soil cesium-137 concentrations in that 10 square kilometer patch remain extraordinarily elevated, levels that would trigger immediate evacuation protocols anywhere else on the planet. Walk into the Red Forest today and your dosimeter does not stay quiet. But something strange began happening almost immediately after the disaster, and it took scientists years to fully understand what they were seeing. In the early 1990s, researchers noticed that the dead pine trees in the Red Forest were not decomposing. Normally, a fallen tree in a temperate forest breaks down within a decade. Bacteria, fungi, and invertebrates dismantle it piece by piece, returning nutrients to the soil. In the Red Forest, that process had essentially stopped. The dead timber was preserved like something under glass. Leaves and organic matter accumulated without breaking down. The nutrient cycle, the foundation of every functioning ecosystem, had flatlined. The reason was direct. Ionizing radiation had suppressed the microbial communities responsible for decomposition. Bacteria and fungi, the organisms that drive decay, are not immune to radiation damage. In high enough doses, their cellular machinery breaks down just like any other organisms. The Red Forest had become a biological pause button. Life had not just been killed. The mechanism for recycling death had been switched off. By the late 1990s, something began to shift. Decomposers started returning cautiously in measurable increments. Nutrient cycling resumed. The forest floor began to change. Scientists tracking soil chemistry documented the gradual reactivation of microbial activity, not at pre-disaster levels, but enough to restart the engine of the ecosystem. It was slow, it was partial, but it was real. And then came the finding that genuinely stopped researchers cold. Radiation-resistant strains of bacteria and fungi had not just survived in the Red Forest, they had moved into the reactor building itself. The concrete shell of Reactor 4, the most intensely radioactive structure built by human hands, had been colonized. Organisms were living inside the walls of a nuclear reactor in conditions that should have been lethal to any biological system. In 2007, a study published in the journal Astrobiology documented something that crossed from remarkable into genuinely paradigm shifting. Melanin-rich fungi, dark pigmented species belonging to genera including Cladosporium and Cryptococcus were found actively growing toward radiation sources inside the Chernobyl reactor, not surviving despite the radiation, growing toward it. The melanin in their cell walls appeared to be absorbing ionizing radiation and converting it into chemical energy in a process researchers compared structurally to photosynthesis. Instead of harvesting light, these organisms were harvesting radiation. The implications took time to land. Radiotropism, the tendency to grow toward radiation, had been documented. These fungi were not just tolerating an extreme environment, they appeared to be exploiting it. The reactor had become, in the most literal sense, a food source. Ekaterina Dadachova at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine led key research into this phenomenon, demonstrating that melanized fungi exposed to ionizing radiation grew significantly faster than control groups not exposed. The mechanism involved melanin's capacity to undergo radiolysis, a chemical transformation triggered by radiation that released usable energy for cellular processes. The red forest the site scientists had written off as a biological wasteland had become an accidental laboratory, and what it was producing was not death, it was novelty. Organisms under extreme selective pressure had found solutions that no evolutionary model had predicted on this timescale. The forest that was supposed to stay silent for centuries had started whispering back within a decade. Picture a wolf moving through the abandoned streets of Pripyat at 3 in the morning. No headlights, no noise, just the wolf, the cracked concrete, and the birch trees pushing up through the pavement. This is not a nature documentary scenario staged for cameras. This is a documented, radio-tracked reality inside the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, and it tells a story about predator ecology that scientists are still working to fully explain. The wolf population inside the zone is estimated at roughly 7 times the density found in surrounding protected reserves. 7 times. In a landscape contaminated by one of the worst nuclear disasters in human history, wolves are thriving at a density that wildlife managers and healthy ecosystems struggle to achieve through active conservation programs. The mechanism is not complicated, even if the implications are. Humans are gone, and humans, it turns out, were the primary limiting factor on wolf survival across this entire region. Without hunters, without farmers protecting livestock, without vehicles and roads fragmenting territory, wolf packs established themselves and expanded with nothing to stop them. Prey species responded accordingly. Roe deer populations surged. Wild boar numbers climbed. Beaver colonies expanded along the river systems. The prey base that wolves depend on had been released from human pressure at exactly the same moment wolves themselves were released from human persecution. The result was an ecological explosion. But here's the detail that everyone missed at the time. The wolves were not staying inside the zone. A 2015 study led by Michael Byrne and colleagues used radio tracking collars to follow wolf movements across the exclusion zone and beyond. What they found was that wolves were regularly crossing zone boundaries and dispersing into a surrounding region covering approximately 45,000 square kilometers. The exclusion zone was not a sealed ecological island. It was functioning as a source population, a reservoir of predators radiating outward into the broader landscape, carrying the zone's ecological dynamics with them into territory that had been wolf depleted for generations. The trophic cascade that followed inside the zone mirrors, in striking ways, what happened in Yellowstone after wolves were reintroduced there in 1995. Wolf predation pressure changed the behavior of prey animals. Deer and boar stopped grazing riverbanks into bare mud. Vegetation recovered along watercourses. Root systems stabilized riverbanks. Canopy cover thickened. The physical landscape was being reshaped by predator-prey dynamics. A cascade of effects running from apex predator down through herbivore behavior, plant recovery, and soil stabilization. The critical difference between Chernobyl and Yellowstone is this. Yellowstone was a deliberate, managed, heavily debated reintroduction program that took years of political negotiation and scientific planning. Chernobyl happened by default. No committee approved it. No management plan governed it. No scientist designed the outcome. The wolves simply moved in because the humans moved out, and the ecosystem restructured itself around their presence without anyone asking it to. Scientists would look back on this moment and wish they'd made a different call about how they modeled the relative impacts of radiation versus human activity on wildlife. The assumption had been that radiation was the dominant variable. The wolves suggested otherwise. The apex predator had returned, and it had brought the entire food chain with it. There is a horse that did not exist in the wild. The Przewalski's horse, a stocky, dun-colored, with a stiff upright mane and a genetic lineage that predates domestication, was declared extinct in the wild in 1969. The last confirmed wild individuals had vanished from the Mongolian steppe. What remained were captive populations in zoos and breeding programs, the entire surviving wild gene pool reduced to animals living behind fences. But the version you've heard about Przewalski's horses probably doesn't include what happened next. In 1998, a coalition of Ukrainian and international conservationists made a decision that looked, on the surface, like either visionary thinking or reckless experimentation. They released 31 Przewalski's horses into the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, the most contaminated large landscape in Europe, a place where the soil was laced with radionuclides and the forests were still recovering from a nuclear explosion that had happened just 12 years earlier. The release came with a deliberate condition: no supplemental feeding, no veterinary intervention after the horses were turned loose, no population management. This was a pure survival test, a question posed directly to the animals themselves. Can you live here? The scientists stepped back and watched. That's not a typo, by the way. 31 horses, no backup plan, into a nuclear exclusion zone. What happened over the following 2 decades reframed the entire conversation about what this landscape actually was. By 2018, the Przewalski's horse population inside the exclusion zone had grown to more than 150 individuals. The herd had not just survived, it had more than quadrupled. It was self-sustaining, reproducing across multiple generations without any human assistance, in a landscape that official assessments had classified as too dangerous for permanent human habitation. The reason, when researchers examined it carefully, came down to a detail nobody had fully anticipated. The collective farmland that Soviet agriculture had maintained across this region, vast, flat expanses of managed grassland, had been reverting to steppe in the absence of human cultivation. Grasses were returning. Shrub encroachment was slower than in forested areas. The open grassland mosaic that was emerging was almost accidentally close to optimal Przewalski's horse habitat. The horses had not been placed into a hostile environment. They had been placed into an environment that was actively becoming the landscape their species had evolved for. Predation pressure from wolves remained a factor. Foals were vulnerable. Pack hunting by the zone's growing wolf population meant that horse survival was not guaranteed, and mortality rates among young animals were measurable. But the population grew anyway, because the habitat quality and the absence of human disturbance outweighed the predation losses. Up to this point, the Przewalski's horse had been losing, retreating from every landscape it had ever occupied, pushed to the edge of extinction by human expansion. That was about to flip. The Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, of all places, became the site where the species found something it had not had in decades: room to exist on its own terms. Imagine standing at the edge of the exclusion zone in early spring and hearing the sky above the abandoned fields absolutely full of birds. Not a few species, not the common farmland birds you'd hear anywhere in Eastern Europe. Rare species that ornithologists travel hundreds of kilometers to find, species that have been squeezed out of every managed agricultural landscape across the continent. Aerial surveys conducted in 2007 recorded more than 280 bird species inside the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone. 280, including white-tailed eagles, one of Europe's largest birds of prey, including black storks, a species so sensitive to human disturbance that it abandons nesting sites at the first sign of agricultural activity, including aquatic warblers, one of Europe's most endangered songbirds, nesting in wetland habitats that had been drained and farmed for generations before the disaster forced their abandonment. The reason for this abundance is structural. Modern agriculture is catastrophic for birds. Pesticides eliminate insect prey. Monoculture fields eliminate nesting cover. Drainage eliminates wetland habitat. Human settlements fragment territory. Remove all of those pressures simultaneously, as the evacuation of the exclusion zone effectively did, and bird populations respond with exactly the kind of recovery that conservation programs spend decades trying to engineer through management. The picture is not clean, and the science is genuinely contested. Anders Muller and Timothy Mousseau, working across a series of studies published between 2006 and 2016, documented troubling findings in bird populations near the reactor. Certain species showed reduced population densities in the most heavily contaminated areas. Individual birds showed elevated rates of tumors. Neurological effects appeared in some populations. Reduced brain size in barn swallows was among the more striking findings, with the researchers linking it to oxidative stress caused by chronic low-level radiation exposure. Reproductive success in some species was measurably lower in high contamination zones compared to lower contamination areas within the zone itself. These findings were serious. They were peer-reviewed. They documented real biological costs of radiation exposure in wild bird populations. Then came the counter-evidence. A 2015 study by Daria Bina and colleagues examining large mammal abundance across the exclusion zone using long-term monitoring data found that populations of elk, roe deer, wild boar, and wolves were all significantly higher inside the zone than in comparable areas outside it. The abundance data did not show the collapse that radiation harm models would predict. It showed the opposite. The scientific debate that followed is itself the most important story here. Both sets of findings can be true simultaneously. Radiation causes measurable biological damage at the individual and population level. Humans cause measurable biological damage at the ecosystem level. The question is which pressure is larger, and the evidence taken together suggests that across most of the zone, for most species, the removal of human activity has produced net ecological gains that outweigh the costs of radiation exposure. Radiation is bad for wildlife. Humans, it turns out, may be worse. There's a reason this story is still talked about today, and it starts with a dog. When the evacuation order came in 1986, residents of Pripyat and the surrounding villages were told to leave their pets behind. The evacuation was supposed to be temporary. 3 days, the authorities said. People left food out for their animals and walked away. The 3 days never ended. Soviet soldiers were subsequently ordered to shoot the abandoned animals to prevent the spread of contamination outside the zone. Many dogs survived anyway. They hid, they scattered, they bred. Today, an estimated 800 to 200 feral dogs live inside the Chernobyl Exclusion Zone, the descendants of pets, running in packs through the abandoned streets, surviving on whatever the contaminated landscape provides. They are not wolves. They are not wild animals in any ancestral sense. They are domestic dogs living in one of the most radiologically unusual environments on Earth, and they have been doing so for nearly 40 years. In 2017, the Clean Futures Fund launched the first systematic effort to study these animals, a program combining veterinary care, vaccination, and genetic sampling that has continued to the present day. The goal was not just animal welfare, it was science. These dogs represented something genuinely rare, a large mammal population that had been living under continuous radiation exposure for multiple generations in an environment with documented mutagenic pressure, with a well-characterized genetic baseline from their domestic ancestors. That's the kind of number that makes accountants cry. 800 to 1,200 animals, 15 generations of reproductive cycles, all happening inside a nuclear exclusion zone with no human interference in their breeding. In 2023, a study published in Science Advances delivered findings that the genetics community had been waiting for. Researchers analyzing DNA samples from Chernobyl dogs and comparing them to dogs living outside the zone found measurable genetic divergence between the two populations, not superficial differences. Divergence in specific genomic regions linked to DNA repair mechanisms and immune response function that showed signatures consistent with positive selection. The populations were pulling apart genetically, and the direction of that divergence pointed toward the pressures of their environment. 15 generations. That is an extraordinarily short time frame to detect this kind of signal in a large mammal. Dogs are not fruit flies. Their generation time is measured in years, not days. The fact that detectable evolutionary pressure was visible across 15 generations suggested that the selective environment inside the zone was genuinely intense, that animals carrying certain genetic variants were surviving and reproducing at higher rates than those without them, consistently enough to shift allele frequencies across the population. These are not mutant monsters. Look like dogs. They behave like dogs. They play and fight and scavenge like dogs anywhere in the world. But at the genomic level, they are becoming something measurably different, a population shaped by a novel environment, adapting at a pace that almost no documented case in large mammals can match. But this wasn't just about the dogs anymore. What the Chernobyl animals, wolves, horses, birds, fungi, and now dogs were collectively demonstrating was something far larger than any single species study could contain. Nature does not wait for permission. Birch and pine have pushed their root systems through the floors and rooftops of Pripyat's apartment blocks, cracking foundations that human engineers built to last a century. Beaver dams on the Pripyat River have created entirely new wetland inland systems, drawing in otters, waterfowl, and amphibians. Lynx, a species that requires vast, undisturbed forest territories to breed successfully, were confirmed reproducing inside the zone by the 2010s. Brown bear tracks appeared in the region for the first time in decades. The wilderness reclaimed its ground without a single management plan. The Chernobyl story isn't unique. How this pattern repeats. Wherever humans withdraw, ecosystems rebuild, reveals something the conservation world has been slow to accept, that the greatest threat to biodiversity has never been radiation or drought or disease. It has been us. Subscribe so you see the next chapter of this story when it drops.